Thank you and good evening. Welcome to our first Public Education Finance Committee meeting of the year. I'd like to call this meeting to order. We will begin with the land acknowledgement. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and our schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, North America. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, we learn, and we live. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Seeing none, we will move on to the agenda. You have an agenda in front of you. Could I ask for somebody to move to approve that agenda? Thank you, Trustee Thompson. All those in favor? Thank you. We have minutes from the June 1st, 2022 Finance Committee meeting in front of us. I need somebody to move the approval of those minutes. And I'm going to go to Trustee Edwards for that. All those in favor? Thank you. I'm going to call on Associate Director Wright to introduce the staff that we have present with us tonight, and we thank everyone for being here. Associate Director Wright, you're on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really pleased that we are joined this evening to help present this draft budget by both of our senior finance managers, Jennifer Machin, Melissa Durward, our planning manager, Lydia Dallop, Superintendent Andrea McCauley, as well as all of the other members of the senior team as required to support, and I echo your thanks for them all joining us.
Thank you. I would then go to Associate Director Wright again to begin his presentation of our budget for next year, draft budget.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really happy to be here this evening to present to trustees with the draft 2023-2024 operating and capital budget. I'll sort of begin talking through the process. If you look on page 5 of your report, 8 of your package, you'll see the budget and financial reporting process for the school board is essentially a 12-month cycle, starting early in the calendar year, putting enrollment projections together, establishing a compliant budget in relation to our funding that is approved by trustees and then the ministry, updating our budget submission to the ministry based on actual information, the number of students that come on October 31st, providing trustees and the audit committee with interim updates throughout the year, and providing the ministry audited financial information as required. So the budget process is really, budget and financial reporting process really covers the entire year. The Grants for Student Need Funding announcement that was released on April 17th is projected to be $27.1 billion. The average per pupil provincial base funding amount is projected to be $13,125. The budget process is certainly a collaborative effort involving the input of trustees, administration, staff, and stakeholders. Responsibilities associated with the budget process are highlighted on page 6 of the report, page 9 of your package. School board budgets are governed by legislation. Highlighted in that legislation is the requirement that school boards prepare and submit a balanced budget. A balanced budget is generally defined by the Ministry of Education as expenses falling within 1% of operating revenues. Also included in legislation are other operational budget-related restrictions, including a number of enveloping provisions required by either a minimum or maximum spend in a specific operational area. Some of these are highlighted on the bottom of page 7 of your report. Areas of capital budget also have restrictions, as exampled on that following page. Please note that the budget we are presenting you this evening for your consideration is a compliant budget. A number of areas figured prominently in our preparation of the draft budget this year in consideration of operations next year in order that we best set ourselves up to support the system and into the future. Student enrollment is what is providing stability and relative consistency in terms of funding into the 2023-2024 school year. This enrollment growth is forecast to continue given the Durham region population projections, which will set DDSB up fairly well in the coming years, though not without some operational concerns associated, the biggest being our ability to ensure the adequate availability of space. Though the ministry has provided a number of capital allocations, we are in the process of adding more pupil places through the building of schools. These are moving through the planning, development, construction process. There is a strong interim need for temporary accommodation. Inflationary pressures that we have seen both over the past year and continuing on through next year have not been recognized in a sufficient manner in the grant funding that we have seen. Adding to the inflationary pressures are unfunded increases to the employer portion of CPP, EI, and pension contributions. With ministry funding increases of 2% last year and this year to the non-staff operating benchmarks, they are largely overshadowed by the near 7% inflation we saw last year and current inflation rate of over 4%. This is a real pressure. This has eroded our buying power as a school board and will impact our ability to continue to purchase supplies and resources going forward. Though the ministry did provide money to purchase student-based technology over the pandemic, that was not provided in a sustainable way. The recent grant funding announcement, this GSN announcement, brought us back to the chronic underfunding that we have faced for a number of years in this area. Moving forward, it does look like we will need to find a more sustainable model to support student technology. Special education expectations and costs continue to increase, particularly as other provincially funded programs are eliminated and community supports become unavailable to families. DDSB continues to invest heavily into supports and services for all students, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Lastly, before I pass over to Lydia to speak about our enrollment projections, I'll draw your attention to page 10 of the report. Education development charges are intended to be a funding mechanism to support the purchase of land for school development. The thinking is that as residential development goes up, each new house contributes a portion to purchase the land to build a school for that community. Unfortunately, EDCs pose a real risk to the organization and frankly to the province as the gap between EDC funds received from residential development and the cost of purchased lands continues to widen. The legislation limiting DDSB's ability to increase EDC charges to an appropriate level is inadequate. Our current estimates indicate growth of our EDC deficit to over $600 million within the next 15 years. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of good news in this year's grants funding announcement. And though we are investing in the future of students and future of the organization, there really is much more we'd like to be doing for the students, stakeholders, and community. Though we may disagree philosophically or politically with the funding model changes that were handed down this year, we are bound by legislation to operate within our funding, and so we will do that. And to that end, we will need to reflect and update on our business and staffing models over the coming year to ensure sustainability going forward. So with that, I'll pass it over to Lydia. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to speak briefly about our enrollment projections. Since 2018, we have been seeing a steady increase in our enrollment across the jurisdiction, and what we anticipate seeing is continued growth over the coming year for the 23-24 school year. We do, however, have a shortfall in available permanent space to accommodate our students. We are making up for that with portables and also looking at creative solutions by using non-traditional classroom space as needed. In 23-24, we anticipate seeing a shortfall of about just under 5,500 spaces in permanent facilities at the elementary level. At the secondary level, we do have available space. However, because our enrollment is increasing in our growth areas, the permanent space in our growth areas are experiencing enrollment pressures. We have looked towards the ministry for providing us with funding to construct new schools, and we are waiting for these approvals. We anticipate increasing our capacity to address some of the enrollment pressures by 2024 with the construction of 2 new schools, elementary, and by 2026 with the construction of a new secondary school. What you'll see on page 16 of your package is an analysis of our projections, our OEP comparison, from 22-23, which is our current year, to the 23-24 year. And you'll see that grade by grade, we are experiencing growth in each of our grades, JK straight through to grade 8 on the elementary, and from grade 9 to grade 12 on the secondary. Secondary growth is not as noticeable as elementary. The difference at the elementary level is over the 22-23 comparison to 23-24, we're at about 2,176 additional students, which is about a 4% increase over our current year. And at the secondary level, it's about 793 students, which is about a 3% increase over our current year. When we compare our enrollments that were projected for our current year, 22-23, and that's the table at the bottom of that page 16, we projected at the elementary level that there would be about 52,575 elementary students. And what we saw with our actual enrollments in October 2022 is an increase of 53,983, a difference of 1,408 students. That's actually 3% more than projected. So we continue to handle that elementary growth, and it is coming from 2 things. Faster pace of new residential development, as well as the affordably priced homes that we have in the existing stock across Durham region. So more people are moving into these homes, and we are seeing the benefit of the increased enrollment. At the secondary level, we do have a slight increase based on our actual enrollments October 2022 to our projected enrollments of 84 students, which is 0.4% more than we projected. So from the perspective of reasonableness test on our enrollment projections, we are within the ballpark. I'm done.
Beginning on page 17, section 4 outlines operating revenue for 2023-2024. The categories are grants for student needs, other government grants, and other revenues. The grants for student needs are divided into 3 main categories: the Pupil Foundation, to support classroom-based staff and supplies; School Foundation, to support administration and support staff; and 16 special purpose grants, which each support a specific area of expenditure. These include student transportation, Indigenous education, special education. Other government grants include priorities and partnerships grants, and they may be from other ministries other than the Ministry of Education, such as Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities, or the Ministry of Citizenship, Immigration and International Trade. Other revenues include community use, tuition fees for Con Ed, and interest earned. Page 19 of the package includes an overview of significant GSN changes. These include benchmark changes. The funded secondary benchmark has been adjusted for online learning. Salary benchmarks were increased, and a 2% cost update was provided for non-staff benchmarks and funding amounts. A number of priorities and partnerships funding were transferred to the GSN, including the demographic data gathering allocation, the early math intervention amount, and the specialist high skills major allocation. There were also new GSN allocations. The Safe and Clean Schools supplement was added to the Learning Opportunities Grant, and the external audit allocation was added to the School Board Administration and Governance Grant. There were also funding model changes related to student transportation, the Indigenous Education Grant and One-Time Realignment Mitigation Fund, and Remote Learning Administration. The Remote Learning Administration was added to offset administration costs as remote learning enrollment was excluded from school and facility-based allocations. Pages 21 and 22 provide line-by-line detail of operating revenue. Beginning on page 23 are details of change in revenue compared to the 2022-2023 revised estimate budget. Enrollment increased by about 1,689 FTE, which generated $13.9 million in revenue. A number of priorities and partnerships funding were transferred to the GSN, as I mentioned. And I would like to note that the specialist high skills major amount was actually an overall reduction, as the prior year allocation was higher than what was transferred to the GSN. And it is included on the other government grants on page 19 as well. The Indigenous Education funding model change accounted for a $1.9 million decrease, and some significant benchmark changes allocated were $16.3 million in changes, the most significant being the CUPE negotiated salary benchmark increases and the labor provision for other groups, which was $9.9 million. Moving to page 24 of the report, another significant change was the teacher qualification and experience allocation. It was $10.8 million, and that will be matched with a corresponding increase in expenditure. The COVID-19 Learning Recovery Fund was discontinued, and that was a reduction of $9.9 million in revenue. Significant new PPF grants are listed under other government grants and fees, including the Math Recovery Plan, the education staff to support reading interventions, and staffing to support de-streaming and transition to high school. On page 25, please note that the tutoring supports program has been discontinued for a reduction of $3.1 million in revenue. You will also see on page 25, the accumulated surplus amount has been updated to show the draw on the reserve, and that does include $120,000 from the Special Education Reserve. Section 5, operating expenditures, begins on page 26. Pages 26 and 27 outline the different expenditure categories. Page 28 provides line-by-line detail of operating expenditures, and for additional information, Appendix A contains a breakdown of payroll versus other expenditures, and Appendix C contains a further breakdown of FTE by type. Page 29 highlights major expenditure variances year over year. As always, there are salary and benefit changes due to grid shifts, labor relations, benefit, and staffing changes. Increased enrollment generated an overall increase of 48.05 FTE elementary teacher positions and an increase of 54.4 FTE secondary teacher positions. Some other changes included transportation, an increase of expected transportation costs compared to the 22-23 school year due to increased enrollment and the addition of expenditures for spare driver capacity and operator recruiting and retention. Retirement gratuity expenses have been decreased to reflect the liability being fully funded by the reserve as per the 21-22 actuarial valuation. As mentioned before, the COVID-19 Learning Recovery Fund was removed from the funding, so there was a decrease in expenditures regarding air filters, PPE, and classroom-related staffing. Decreased expenditures relating to SIA equipment and tutors relating to the one-time use of 2022-2023 have been removed from the budget. And software licensing and implementation costs have increased due to the increased cost of licensing and expenses associated with the implementation of an ERP system. The expenditures related to the new priorities and partnerships funding have been included in the budget. including education staff to support reading interventions, staffing to support de-streaming and transition to high school, the math recovery plan, and the removal of these expenses associated with the tutoring allocation. Section 6, Special Education Operating Revenue and Expenditures, begins on page 30. The early math intervention amount has been included, and this was the amount previously provided through a priorities and partnerships funding, and will be used to support summer learning opportunities. Please note the wording regarding SIP funding will be updated for the final copy of the budget book, as the funding is no longer based on claims, and the ministry is currently reviewing the model and using a formula to calculate the amount for each school board. Now I'd please ask Superintendent Macaulay to discuss the special education expenditures.
Thank you. It is important to note this evening and begin the presentation on special education by noting that our shared commitment to inclusion and accommodation is built into the proposed budget across all of our departments, from transportation through to the spaces students access and commitments through facility services to student programming supported by teaching and learning. Inclusion is a commitment we all share. Funding for special education and mental health supports in Ontario is based both on enrollment and allocation-based amounts. At core in the Durham District School Board, direct service to students and their supports is prioritized within special education and mental health expenditure planning. The vast majority of funds are utilized to provide school-based and direct service, for example, our clinical support staff, in providing student supports for well-being, mental health, and learning. Staffing is inclusive of those that work directly in classrooms, school-based support staff, such as CERTs, and our inclusive student services teams. Services are provided to students in all of our schools, including our single-track French immersion schools. The next layers of priority within the expenditures are our special equipment allocation, or SIA funding, and supporting the professional learning that directly impacts on programs and services. Diving a bit deeper into our classroom support staff, this includes professionals in the roles such as educational assistants, ASL interpreters, and interveners. We also consider special education class teachers within the primary, most direct support to our students. These roles are supported by special education resource teachers, and all of those roles are funded through the special education budget. Overall, from the current school year to next, we are increasing the number of special education classes, providing program access for students through practical learning, life skills, and developmental-based programs at the elementary level. Also, responsive to student needs for direct support and our district commitments, the draft budget does include staffing additions to the following teams. 3 speech-language pathologists, as these roles are key in collaboration with teaching and learning to supporting programming aligned with the recommendations from the Ontario Human Rights Commission Right to Read inquiry. A social worker, as well as a psychometrist, both added to augment our mental health supports, serving direct to students. As Jen mentioned, the Special Incidents portion, or SIP funding, is specific to our students who require 2 or more board support staff with them for the majority of their school program. In most cases, applications reflect the intensity of educational assistance support alongside our students in their daily program. Historically, districts have applied on a student-by-student basis for this funding. Within the funding guidelines, as Jen referenced, for the next school year, the ministry has indicated a review of the SIP funding process that will be engaged during the next school year, and that a benchmark rather than a claim submission is to be used for 23-24. This is significant in the number of professional staff hours turned back into direct student support. Boards have not yet received the funding formula or the amount. As a result of this, at this time, we have reflected our current year revenue carried forward for 23-24. It is important that this is not new money or new positions, as we factor special incidents portion funding into both revenue and expenditure calculations reflected in our permanent educational assistant staff full-time equivalent or number of positions that are allocated out to schools. This is reflected on page 18 of your package, line 5. Also within the booklet, we reference an expenditure from the Special Education Reserve funding. As a growth enrollment district, attractive to families and children and youth seeking local services, such as those through a strong Children's Treatment Center partner, student transitions include a boundary review within Oshawa and many new construction neighborhoods. And based on that, we have built-in recommendation for the final of a multi-year planned draw on the Special Education Reserve to bolster educational assistant positions for the first 4 weeks of the school year. This model, run over the last couple of years, has had positive feedback when implemented. For both September 2021 and September 2022, we drew each year 40% of the reserve, and that was made to address transitions within and from the pandemic. Planning at this time last year left a 20% final draw on the reserve funds for the start of the upcoming school year. The expenditure for fall 2023, as noted on page 32 of the budget book, is $120,413. Based on most recent planning from the team, since submitting the draft writing for the book, is to amend plans to support a 6-week transition position for the students moving from Clara Hughes to Village Union, 20 4-week positions, which will support where new special education classes are new opens or class moves between current year and next, an additional 5 4-week roles to be determined based on individual student transition needs. In addition to tremendous student support, these positions activate assignments for educational assistants who are part of our supply pool, which has, based on a year-to-year pattern, a lower rate of assignment during the first month of school comparative to further in the school year. In closing, I would like to draw your attention to the final line on page 32 of the budget book, indicating that the budget has a planned deficit to the envelope, meaning that structured within our proposed budget for 23-24 is an intentional overspend of just over $3 million to the envelope provided by the ministry. This amount is indicated as a deficit as it is spending above the envelope. In a navigation of fiscal responsibility and at benefit of increased enrollment, increasing special education revenue, the proposed budget brings our intentional overspend closer in line with the funding model from the ministry, while concurrently increasing special education and mental health supports for students. This again sits within an overall district plan which embeds across all department budgets a commitment to inclusion, accommodation, student learning, and well-being core to our services as a district.
Beginning on page 34 of the package this evening is section 7, the capital budget for 2023-2024. The budget for next year, capital budget for next year, totals $126.3 million. And it's important to remember when looking at the capital budget that although a grant may be allocated in a particular fiscal year, the expense is often over multiple years. The capital budget can be broken into 3 main categories. The first of these categories is Education Development Charges, or EDCs. These are fees that are levied on new residential building permits, and the board uses those funds to purchase new school sites and develop those school sites to accommodate the growth in those areas. For 23-24, we're anticipating collecting $9 million. However, as Associate Director Wright mentioned, the EDC fund for the board is currently in a deficit, so all of those funds will go towards the deficit. And the in-year budgeted purchase of sites for $20.5 million will simply be added on to that deficit to be funded at a later time. The second category in the capital budget and largest are the ministry funded items. First one being facility upgrade projects. The school condition improvement grant and the school renewal grant are used to replace and repair major components in buildings. Something new to note for the 23-24 school year is that these annual allocations will now have an expiry date approximately 2.5 years after allocation. The project lists associated with these two funds can be found on Appendix B, Schedules 1 and 2. We saw slight increases in both of those grants year over year. One of the other types of funding we receive from the ministry is for retrofitting space in our schools to repurpose. Currently, we have approvals for childcare centers within our schools, and we've noted 4 of those upcoming projects here in the report this evening. The temporary accommodation grant received from the ministry is used to fund temporary accommodation, so purchase of portables, movement of portables, leasing space, etc. We again saw a small increase year over year, and the funding will be used to purchase additional portables in the 23-24 school year to help with the accommodation of new growth. On page 36 of tonight's package are the details surrounding new construction. The allocations that we receive from the ministry for new construction would cover new schools, replacement schools, as well as additions to existing schools. And all of this funding is project-based and based on business case submissions, so we're not able to transfer the funds between projects. The board currently has 6 projects under this type of funding. 2 are schools that are under construction, 2 projects awaiting ministry approval, and 2 projects that have begun design. Details for these projects can be found in Appendix B, Schedule 3. The final type of funding and expense on the capital budget under the ministry funding is for the long-term financing. And the long-term financing is associated with the construction of new schools and additions. And naturally, this amount will decline as the principal balances decline. The third and final portion of the capital budget is other funding, more specifically proceeds of disposition. And these are revenues that are generated from the sale of properties and buildings and are used for the renewal of existing schools. Finally, on page 38 of tonight's package, you will see the capital budget breakdown for the next school year. That's the end of our presentation. We're happy to take any questions.
Again, this will be an informal time. If you have a question or a comment about operating budget, capital budget, special education budget, simply press your button and you will speak.
Thank you. I have several questions, but I won't, I'll give opportunity for other trustees to ask some questions, but I have huge concerns around the ability to support our students with special needs. When we look at the potential, the projected enrollment, and we know that a percentage of those students who will be attending will partake in some of our inclusive services. I'm grateful that we have tried to maintain and by getting money out of our reserves again, but that basically will create huge stress on the existing staff. Even though we've increased them, most of that is temporary. We're talking about supports, and which is, again, it's a proven record as far as providing that support at the beginning of the year. But these students will be here for the whole year. So I really still have huge concerns on the ability to support, especially when our SIP claims are going to be benchmarked. And considering the track record of benchmarks of the government, and I'm sorry this is a bit of a diatribe, the benchmark from the governments are usually lower. And I noticed they did eliminate in the technical paper the actual amount that they provided for benchmarks. Previously, it was just over 28,000, I believe, for our SIP claims. And if that's the benchmark that they are going to use, when we're talking about over two staff, that nowhere carries the cost of supporting those students. So I guess is that we haven't received any details on the SIP claims at this point in time, as I think as you've indicated. Is there any indication on when they're going to come back with actually the details on their review process on that? Because that's huge.
So our understanding is that that amount will be a table amount, that it will be included in the legislation when it is passed. So at this point, we don't have an indication. We don't know if they'll tell us what the benchmark salary to support is, or if they'll just give DDSB a dollar amount based on our previous claims plus an enrollment growth factor. So you'll have to hang tight on that one, and as soon as we have a better understanding, then we'll be happy to share that information.
Thank you. The other thing is around, and the devil's is in the details. Again, around transportation and our supports. My understanding is around benchmarks have not been included for certain types of vehicles that we offer to support our students with their special needs. Could you please clarify that as far as the benchmarks, what are being supported? Because these are accommodation needs required that we need to one, the students are required to, they have the right to have an education, and two, they have a right to accommodations. I much appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure to expand a little bit on that. We're still working our way through the transportation funding model. It was in the works for a significant number of years and pretty complicated. We do know, though, that funding for transportation based on the routing simulations that were performed by Durham Student Transportation Services provides funds for large buses, medium buses, and small-size buses. We know that we transport students, or DSTS supports students on our behalf with other vehicles as well, including caravans and taxis. Caravans and taxis are not a vehicle that is being, or not vehicles that are being supported under this new funding model. So there is a small pool of local priorities funding in the new transportation grant, and I believe it's the ministry's expectation that any transportation outside of bus transportation will be funded through that local priorities amount.
The other thing is, again, about benchmarks. And again, across the province, this is not only a DDSB problem, but, and you've mentioned it in your notes, around EI and basically the statutory benefits are not funded fully in our GSNs. These are mandatory, as you know, statutory benefits that we have to pay. They have been increasing, and the Ministry of Education hasn't provided what is the total amount that should be funded because they are paid. What is the total amount that the board is paying out of other funds in order to get to pay mandatory statutory benefits?
So I believe that 23-24 will be the third consecutive year of CPP and EI increases with no reflective increase in the funding benchmark. So we're probably in the neighborhood of $4 million in terms of cumulative impact in next year's GSN, or excuse me, not GSN, next year's budget. Year over year, we're looking at $1.5 million increase over this year to those, to the employer portion of those unfunded benchmarks, benefit amounts. So the employer portion of CPP and EI. So certainly a significant amount. I know that there have been conversations with the Ministry of Education. Certainly our sector has let the ministry know enough times that this is a real issue that we're really hoping they look at it. It is something that is impacting every board in this province, and it is compounding inflationary pressures. It's taking away any flexibility we have over grant funding. So it's putting us in a tough spot for sure.
Okay. I'm looking at the student enrollment anticipated for September of this coming year. You are expecting that we're going to have an increase of approximately 3,000, 3,100. Are we prepared for that? Because I'm looking at construction in all of our municipalities, and I'm thinking maybe we're underestimating that. Are we concerned?
I think, Madam Chair, it's always a concern. However, at this point in time, we have managed to find creative solutions in order to ensure that we have adequate accommodation for all of our students. Earlier in my presentation, I mentioned that we not only looked at our existing permanent capacity or permanent classroom space, but also non-traditional classroom space. So when we're looking at non-traditional, we're looking at things such as, can we accommodate students temporarily in libraries if they're available, or in on stages if they're acceptable? Because at this point in time, we do have a small shortage of portables, and that is actually not something that is unique to this board. It is across the province on the shortage of portables. We are working actively to secure more portables, but at this point in time, we do have the spaces available as a temporary stopgap measure until we can get additional pupil places or additional school spaces in place.
Thank you. Are there some areas in our region under greater pressure than others?
I would say yes. All of our growth areas are under greater pressure than others, and I'm thinking specifically of North Oshawa, West Whitby, and the Pickering-Seton area. So we are managing, but again, it's how can staff get creative in order to accommodate our students appropriately until funding and approvals from the ministry comes through.
Thank you. I was in Beaverton today, and I was so pleased to see how quickly that construction is going on. And the school administrators, they were very pleased with the relationship that the construction people, they meet regularly. They have a good relationship. Very positive. Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I may, just a small point of clarification. I think you might have indicated growth more significantly than we anticipate. I don't think we're anticipating 3,000 additional students next year. Okay, never mind. Thank you.
Ben, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So I would just say I'm new to this process, and I know a lot of trustees are new to this process. I'm wondering how, as an example, say I didn't like librarians and I didn't want us to have any librarians. How might we go about, not that I support that, but how might we go amending the budget or, getting rid of librarians in this example?
It's a bit of a tricky question, Trustee Cameron. Trustees are responsible for ensuring that they pass a legislatively compliant budget, and certainly we want to hear from the community about priorities and trustees about priorities in terms of specific staffing levels and how that is seen on the ground. We need to consider a number of things, including collective agreement language, understanding that your situation is hypothetical, but there would be a number of considerations on the ground, including operationally how best to support students. So if you do have specific concerns about any of the staffing levels, really happy to have that conversation, but it is a complicated process to pick an individual staff group and affect changes at this point.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask a question about the Special Education and Community Partnership Program and the deficit in that area. Can I have some understanding of how that will impact that sector, especially because some of the developmental programs are supported by those community partnerships?
Thank you. So our education community partnership programs are our day treatment partnerships. And so that is where there's a strong commitment from the district to be the educational partner to our mental health community-based agencies. And so we partner with 15 different agencies to provide over 50 classrooms. The enrollment or subscription of children and youth to the mental health side, or partner side, does move how many spaces and places and programs we need. And sometimes adjustments to their budgets also impact how many programs they are able to offer. We keep 1 for 1 in response to what they offer. So where a partner indicates low roster and closure, because they're not able to maintain funding, then we notify our ministry of a closure, and we did have a one class closure partway through this year. So the amount you see is representative of a percentage of a teaching position as we move into next year's budget, just to right fit that. But I want to assure trustees we have a very strong model of educational community partnerships in Durham. Our scope provincially is second only to that which operates in Toronto in size and scope. So again, just over 50 individual program spaces with average rosters of about 8 students each, times over 50 program spaces. So it remains a very robust program for services for children and youth within the Durham region. But we are in partnership, so that's constantly tied. Our teacher portion as well is tied to the exact grid placement for each of our educational teaching staff within that program. So depending year to year on the teaching complement within Grove School, our budgets are adjusted based on the salary grid level, experience-wise for each of the individual teachers, because our grant is based on one program class, one grant application specific to the educator. So there can be adjustments that way as well that impact the budget, but maintain full service to students.
Again, one, and I'm going to call it as is. As a lot of this, when it comes to the details, is the ministry has a tendency to play shell games when they move things from a priorities grant, a PPF, into the GSNs. And I look in particular around the specialist high school major programs that the ministry is pushing to ensure that we have students have access to apprenticeship programs earlier, etc. Special high school major programs do support the education and building of our students in going into those programs, into basically apprenticeships or furthering on into to post-secondary. And here we are, I look at it, and I think it's not quite half that we're losing, moving from basically the PPF into the grants for students' needs. How is that as an expansion of our specialist high school major programs? And I know that we have to apply, but we had many this year, and I can't see us decreasing with the priorities that the government has. How did that happen? That's a facetious question, I don't know, because this really kills me. How does this happen when they're decreasing it and they're supposed to, the priorities are around building the capacity and building the skills and trades? It's ridiculous. That's all I can say. I'm sorry. The other question I also have is when we're trying to support our community and our very diverse community, and I look at the language ESL, and we basically have again $1.7 million decrease in that particular section. What statistics are they basing this on? Because our diversity has changed.
Funding for ESL is specific to newcomers to Canada, and there's a specific funding formula that is on a decreasing scale. So students that arrive from a non-English speaking country are funded for 4 years through the ESL grant on a decreasing scale. So the first year they land in Canada, they're funded for a higher amount than the second year, and so on. We're not sure what's going on with this grant amount. We know that we are seeing newcomers arrive at DDSB, so we're trying to figure out if they're coming via other areas, that, you know, this isn't the first year they've come to school. And so part of that ESL grant has already been used at other schools, or what have you. The grant certainly doesn't seem to reflect the number of new students we're seeing in the district. So we're hoping that the information we have is different at our revised estimate submission, that we're able to see an increase in that grant and provide more English as a second language and English language supports for our newcomer students.
Sorry, just to bring up the portable shortage situation, and having to have students in classrooms around the school. Do we know how long that will be? Are we looking at roughly months of this, or are we looking at the full year?
So we faced a similar situation at the start of this school year. We had quite a significant number of students attend in September that we didn't project in the budget process last year, and so we were left scrambling, and there were a number of classes that were on stages and in libraries and in non-purpose-built spaces. So we're trying to get ahead of it a little bit better for next year and create some of those spaces and ensure that where we create classes, they are sustainable. We're not going to be in a great spot next year in terms of surplus spaces at pretty much any school. And so it may be a situation for the next year or two where we have to maintain use in those non-technical or traditional classroom spaces. We are reducing that wherever we are able to. We have applied for use of proceeds of disposition funds to purchase additional portables to increase our capacity, our temporary accommodation capacity. Unfortunately, there's a significant lead time and there's a lot of competition for those units. So we're doing everything we can to keep kids off of stages. And where we are able to create a space, put up a wall, for example, in a library or a learning commons to create a more suitable classroom space, we're doing that. So we're doing everything we can, understanding that that some of the spaces available aren't ideal.
I'm sorry for monopolizing the questions tonight. But the other area that is a significant decrease, I think I calculated is 42%. I might be wrong. My math isn't the best as far as, but I look at the Indigenous Education Grant of $3.6 million deficit in that particular area. What impact is that going to have in serving our students?
It was an unfortunate change to the funding methodology for Indigenous education, certainly. We don't know what impact it's going to have on students, nothing positive. We won't be able to provide the supports we otherwise might have been able to under the previous model. The Ministry of Education is requiring us to hold a fairly significant amount at this point based on their consultation and their determined priorities. We are hoping that the Ministry's priorities align with the consultation we undertook with our local Indigenous community and our partners, and that we are able to continue supporting in the way that we have been. So in spite of the change to the funding model, we do have a commitment to supporting Indigenous education, Indigenous students, and reconciliation, and we'll continue to do that as best we're able with the funding.
I'm thinking, Trustee Edwards, that when you meet or when you teleconference with the minister, you could address some of these questions on that teleconferencing call.
We're usually allowed only one question, so we might have to pick our priority, but I will speak on behalf of the board when it comes to some of these questions. And again, I do appreciate the amount of time and effort that has been put in the budget and being able to try to keep at least the services. But we're still going into our reserves to support our most vulnerable students and ensuring that they reach their potential at this point in time. And that still bothers me. I mean, the last time we continue to support that, and we cannot support that with the other challenges that we are facing within this budget, and the way the ministry continues to envelope and put further restrictions on those envelopes is really frustrating to be able to do, as you said, Associate Director, to provide more for our students. Again, I do appreciate all the effort and what the staff has done to put a budget together, but we're still operating basically a 1% deficit. How long is that deficit? What time frame are we allowed to keep, because we have to have a plan in place to put that deficit together. How long do we have to ensure that we actually pay that deficit off, or put us into the black, if you wish?
So we are well within the parameters, where 1% for our board is closer to $1 million. So $9 million, $8 or $9 million would be our 1%, and we're at about $2.6 million. So well within. The deficit recovery plan is at max a 3-year plan. There are pieces that are driving our deficit that aren't particularly structural. For example, we have an ERP project that we are supporting that is not, to the tune of about $1 million, that is not structural in nature, in that it is more of a one-time expense than an ongoing expense. So we'll need to put a plan together. We're going to bring the deficit recovery plan to trustees as part of the budget approval in June, and there'll be a number of ways that we address it. Obviously, the big one-time expense, we are going to look at our staffing levels and staffing allocations and see if we need to realign and reallocate over the next year. We do expect ongoing enrollment increases, which again create some economies of scale and will help take some of that pressure off. So not saying that we won't have a deficit in the coming years, but it may be driven by different things.
I'm curious to know, are we as trustees able to do anything with the EDC challenges that we're facing? Could you make any recommendations? I know that you and your staff are approaching this, but is there anything that we can do to help?
I really appreciate that question. Advocacy on behalf of the situation certainly can't hurt, and I think at this point that's about all we can do. There is, as I mentioned, 2024 is the end of our EDC bylaw, and so we're starting to gather information right now on what the next 4-year projection looks like. And based on the growth forecast in Durham region, I expect that we'll need to continue to acquire land, and that'll continue to put pressure and increase the EDC deficit. So, the more we talk about it with other partners, AMO, the municipal associations also are aware of the situation, and all of our friendly ministry folks, it would be good. As much pressure as we can apply to help them really get back to the intent of EDCs, and that's, again, paying for the cost of school development through residential development would be great. Appreciate your support.
Are there further comments? Are there further questions? We will go back to Trustee Edwards.
Just to bring that up, I know with the recent legislation around building homes faster and so forth, that municipalities have been hit where they cannot charge, have developmental charges. And I know that many of the municipalities in Durham have been speaking up about that. Maybe they will be a little bit more empathetic that what we've been dealing with. I'm not 100% sure of that, but that those development charges that they used to be able to use did support. I mean, you're looking at who's going to pay for the additional new infrastructure that is required for these new homes. And yes, they're talking about infilling, but still the increased capacity of the homes, there may be changes to, again, the infrastructure that is required and to support the increased capacity of the homes that the multiple dwellings that they're building. I can think of particular areas in Ajax that could not support, the older areas of Ajax that cannot support the infrastructure, particularly downtown Ajax, where there isn't basically the support to do some of the things to proceed in some of the development that they want to do. Or puts additional strain. So I'm hoping they will. But this is a huge issue when government doesn't talk to and consult with their partners, because schools are part of supporting the needs of the community, all these people that they're wanting to come into and support for housing. I have a huge issue with that. And I know that we, and along that lines though, we also got Bill 98. And I have huge concerns when that legislation, and I say when, because we have a majority government. We know that they're going to be they have been or will be, and committee is still reviewing some of the things, but what will be some of the impacts that we will have if Bill 98 goes forward, particularly on our budgets? If it goes forward as is, do we have any idea what the impact would be?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's pretty early to know. Number one, we don't know if the legislation will end up being passed in the same form, but there's a lot of vague language. You know, the ministry can put some direction over school board revenue. For example, the ministry can direct disposition of property. It's really difficult at this point to tell what financial impact there may be, what governance impact there may be, what operational impact there may be. I mean, it's certainly broad legislation, certainly potential for significant impact on school boards, governance and operations, but the extent to which really can't say at this time.
Is there any further business? Seeing no hands. If there is no other business, I'm thinking that we could adjourn. But I do want to announce that our next public meeting is May the 31st, a couple of weeks, and I am hoping that all could be in attendance for that meeting. We look forward to seeing you then. Consider this meeting to be adjourned. Thank you to staff for joining us.